Putin is nothing if not smart. And he knows that he is outgunned and outfinanced and outmanned the minute he attacks and brings NATO into this war. He will not do that.
What's your current analysis of the situation in Ukraine at the moment?
I'm optimistic and I'm sad. This is a bloodbath. This is not a wonderful prospect for a nation that just wants to be a nation. And of course, Putin is I think, monstrous. But the situation is such that the Ukrainians have continued to fight, be resilient, courageous, and Europe is finally waking up, and as is the United States. So today is a very important day. May 31st marks when Germany, France, Britain, and the United States, it looks like, have finally given permission to the Ukrainians to strike back at Russia inside Russia during the war to protect themselves with their weapons. This is a huge turning point.
President Biden has given Ukraine permission to launch American missiles at Putin's military inside Russia that are involved with the Kremlin's offensive in the Kharkiv region. Why do you think that there has been this major change in policy?
Well, I think because Putin uses every angle he can. And one of the reasons he mounted that offensive was to spread out Ukraine's defenses. But also, the second largest city is only a few kilometers from the Russian border. So he could just sit up there in the Russian border and lob bombs and kill children and ruin everything, bomb textbook factories at will without any counter fire, because the restrictions were there in place on the weaponry, the long range weaponry that the Europeans and Americans have given the Ukrainians. So it's, sort of like finally being able to fight fire back with fire. And that will make a very big difference.
I guess the limitations is that this permission, it only applies for that area in Kharkiv. Do you think that this will be enough to bolster support for Ukraine?
Well, that is the American stipulation. But the German, French, and British stipulations for their long-range missiles do not say that. Neither does I don't know what the restrictions will be, but the F-16 fighter jets that are about to arrive, which I think will turn the tide of the war dramatically quickly, are with the permission of European countries who have gifted them to Ukraine. And I don't think they have any restrictions.
Do you see there being any more leeway in the US's decision on this?
I don't think there need be at this point. If the Europeans allow the bombing and the F-16s arrive. But, look, you're either all in or you're not in at all. And he is a very difficult person. What's happened since this red letter day when these permissions were granted is that Putin again played his nuclear escalation game. He didn't say anything this time, but before they made the decision, he warned them about a nuclear response. But he doesn't do this personally. But when this permission was granted, there was one of his party members in the Duma that said, I think we should do a demonstration nuclear bomb just to make them focus their minds on what they may be in for. And so that has not stopped. Biden went ahead, and it shouldn't. And remember, Britain is a nuclear power. The Americans are nuclear powers. The French are. I mean, he's matched. He's more than matched.
Russia has made a response to this change, and they've said that NATO and the US is provoking a new level of tension. Do you think that there is any substance in that claim?
No, this is more tough talky, before the bullies actually start to hit each other. And I'm afraid that we may inevitably lead there. However, Putin is nothing if not smart. And he knows that he is outgunned and outfinanced and outmanned the minute he attacks and brings NATO into this war. He will not do that.
Do you think that there's any sort of dangers to almost disregarding these threats as empty?
Of course, there's dangers. But Zelensky has said, look, he likes life too. He's not going to do this. He's not going to start a nuclear war because, and I don't mean to sound like a tough guy or anything, but he's got three nuclear powers against him, NATO's forces. The GDP of the NATO countries is like 100 times bigger than Russia's. One nuclear incident, and Russia will be turned into cinders. I mean, that's the reality of it. He may do some damage too, and that's really scary. But, this is, at the end of the day, he's rational.
Aside from, nuclear threats, do you think that there is any other alternative ways that Putin may react to this?
Well, he's already reacted to the Ukrainians bombing Crimea and bombing and using drones to destroy his oil facilities inside Russia by, ferociously killing civilians in Ukraine. That's his response. There's, just constant bombardment because they don't have air cover until the F-16s arrive. And there's some things that are underway that are going to be helpful.
You recently wrote how US mainstream media press has turned negative about Ukraine's prospects. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, I noticed this turn because, having run a newspaper myself, you're in the news and you always want to get ahead of the competition. Everybody's covering the war, the Wall Street Journal, the Wash Post, the Times, everybody. And so the New York Times, who doesn't have any direct expertise, by the way, in any of this, none of these newspapers do. I'm not impressed with any of their reportage. Basically, they're relying on bloggers, secondhand hearsay, reading reports by generals in the field, and so on. And so they decided to get ahead of the New York Times in particular. Let's get ahead of the competition by saying it's looking bad. They're getting overwhelmed. They're retreating. Just the language they used. And then, of course, that was matched by the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post and many other newspapers. So it's just a narrative chase that is an internal media situation that I found particularly wrong because it was inaccurate and based on selective, isolated information, uncorroborated, and mislead. It was just misleading. And so, these are the things that we media people have to watch with our competition. And this is just an internal media problem.
I guess in response to that, we've seen Russia currently occupies around 18% of Ukraine at the moment. And we're also seeing their current offensive, especially in the Kharkiv region. Do you not think that that is of some concern for Ukraine?
Totally so. And that is very concerning. And Zelensky has, worked the phones, and now he's got permissions to use long-range weapons the way they were intended to use, and that was to kill Russians inside Russia or inside Ukraine. And so, there's been a lot of loss and devastation and suffering, but the NATO side has responded with, I think, a solid front, and now that has fortified Ukraine more than before.
We did have the US approving that aid package to Ukraine, and we are seeing a trickle through of that aid and weaponry to Ukraine. But for example, Zelensky said, this is a decision that was made too late. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, it was made too late because they lost 5% of their country. They did a counteroffensive, and then they were stopped. And then this nonsense with the financing in the United States happened. It was a 6-month delay. I think there were still weapons trickling through, and the Europeans were sort of stepping up their game quite dramatically too, fortunately. But the thousands of lives were lost, and about 5% of the country they lost back to the Russians after having regained it from the initial invasion in February. So that was the loss, and that's very serious. That has to be, made up somehow if possible, but we'll see. It's a horrible situation, but the Ukrainians would rather die than be Russian. So that's the calculus that maybe Putin didn't make, that they were willing to die rather than be under the control of Moscow again. And this is what we've seen demonstrated over and over again. The resolve is there. The polling shows it. The spirit shows it. So this is going to be the deciding factor in the war. They would rather die than be Russian. They will fight to the death, to the man, woman, and child. And the West is now finally recognizing that they have to help them.
Can you make any predictions for the end of summer for Ukraine?
At this point, and it's a stalemate, I mean, because the Russians have 600,000 troops inside Ukraine now. The entire Ukrainian army is 1 million. But what you've got is, so let's call it a stalemate of sorts with the help of the West. I think that they are possibly now fighting for the DMZ line. In other words, wherever, when the first one says, and Russia's already making noises about a ceasefire. Ceasefire is, a euphemism for we give up at this point. And if that is something that Ukraine agrees to, and they may not, then that's going to be where the negotiations start. And you and I and everybody else knows that the border will not shift. Then it will become a frozen conflict again. And instead of 7.5% of the country, they will have 15% of the country. And prepare to take more again.
In terms of Vladimir Putin's inner circle, we've had President Xi, he has openly condemned and allegedly privately condemned Putin's threats of nuclear war. Who do you think that Putin has surrounding him right now?
He has yes men surrounding him. He really is also not only the last European empire standing, but maybe the most powerful dictator in history because he has a nuclear arsenal. He has a dysfunctional democracy beneath him, a faux democracy. The election was a joke. And the war has enabled him to throw in jail everyone who would possibly oppose him for anything. And so he has solidified his power. And so I think that the only thing that will rid the world of Vladimir Putin is a defeat in Russia. And by defeat, I mean that Ukraine is able to push them back and maybe retake Crimea. But that isn't also necessary. I think the defeat will be when NATO rears its head and said, enough of this, stop it already, and defies it. And then he's really lost the war against the West. And then he may be toppled or given a window tax, as they say, pushed backward out of a window, defenestrated.